The maid was 7 months pregnant, scrubbing the floor of a castle that wasn't hers, when the Duke walked in and said 4 words that changed everything. "She will be mine." Nobody in that hallway breathed. Nobody moved. Because the men saying it wasn't just any duke. He was the most powerful man in the entire region, a man who had turned down princesses, refused countesses, and lived alone in a castle everyone whispered was cursed by loneliness. And now he was pointing at a servant girl covered in dirt, swollen with a child that wasn't his, and claiming her as his own. The room erupted in gasps. Someone dropped a tray. And the maid, whose name was Elira, simply stood there, frozen, waiting for the cruel joke to reveal itself. But it never did. Because the Duke meant every single word. And what happened next would turn an entire kingdom's understanding of power, pride, and love completely upside down. 3 months earlier, nobody would have looked twice at Elira. She was just another face in the servants' quarters, another pair of hands scrubbing pots before sunrise and folding linens long after the candles burned low. She had come to the Duke's estate with nothing but a small bag and a secret she carried heavier than any bucket of water. The other maids didn't know her past. They didn't ask. In a place like this, everyone had a story they buried, and Elira buried hers deeper than most. She had once lived in a small village 3 days' ride from the capital, the daughter of a blacksmith who taught her that hard work was the only inheritance worth having. Her mother had died when she was young, so it had always been just the 2 of them, her and her father, hammering out a life from iron and stubbornness. She grew up strong, quick-witted, and painfully honest, the kind of honest that got her into trouble more often than it got her out of it. But she also grew up kind, the kind of kindness that doesn't announce itself, that just quietly shows up when someone needs it most. Her life changed the night her village burned. Nobody ever found out exactly how the fire started. Some blamed a lantern knocked over in a barn. Others whispered it was set on purpose by men working for a rival lord who wanted the land cleared. Whatever the cause, the flames didn't care about blame. They took everything. Her father's forge. Their small home. And her father himself, who ran back into the burning house to save the one thing he thought mattered most, a small wooden box that held her mother's letters. He never came back out. Elira stood in the smoke that night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a grief so heavy it felt like it might crush her lungs. She was 18 years old, completely alone, and utterly unprepared for what the world was about to throw at her next. She wandered for weeks, sleeping in barns, trading small chores for bread, until she reached the edge of the Duke's territory. She had heard stories about him, the way people always hear stories about powerful men, half of them exaggerated, half of them terrifying. They said he was cold. They said he had no heart. They said his own father had raised him to believe that emotion was a weakness that got people killed, and that the young Duke had taken that lesson and turned it into armor. But Elira didn't care about stories. She cared about surviving. She applied for work in the kitchens, and because the estate was massive and always short-staffed, she was hired without much ceremony. Nobody bothered to ask where she came from. Nobody bothered to notice her at all, which, at the time, was exactly what she wanted. For a while, that anonymity felt like safety. Then she met him. Not the Duke. Someone else entirely, a traveling merchant's son who visited the estate to deliver goods and somehow always found an excuse to linger near the kitchens. He was charming in the way that dangerous people often are, full of promises he had no intention of keeping. Elira, still raw from losing everything, still desperate for something that felt like warmth, let herself believe him. By the time she realized what kind of man he truly was, it was too late. He vanished one morning without a word, leaving behind nothing but silence and a secret growing inside her that she would have to carry alone. She told no one at first. She couldn't. In a place like this, a pregnant unmarried maid wasn't just gossip fuel. She was one accusation away from losing her position entirely, one whisper away from being thrown out into a world that had already tried to destroy her once. So she hid it as long as she could. She wore looser clothes. She worked twice as hard to distract from the exhaustion. She told herself that somehow, someway, she would figure out a plan before anyone noticed. But secrets like that don't stay buried forever. It was the head housekeeper who noticed first, the sharp-eyed woman who ran the servants' quarters like a general commanding troops. She confronted Elira in the laundry room, arms crossed, voice low and furious. "You'll be dismissed the moment the Duke finds out," she hissed. Do you understand what you've done? Elira understood perfectly. She just didn't have anywhere else to go. Word spread through the servants' quarters like fire through dry grass. Whispers followed her everywhere. Some maids avoided her like she carried a disease. Others openly mocked her, calling her names under their breath just loud enough for her to hear. A pregnant maid with no husband and no family was, in their eyes, the lowest rung of an already low ladder. She kept her head down. She kept working. She told herself the humiliation was temporary, that eventually the baby would come and life would somehow sort itself out. She had no idea the Duke was already watching. His name was Alaric, though almost nobody in the household dared say it aloud without a title attached. He had inherited the estate at 22 after his father's sudden death, and in the 6 years since, he had built a reputation as untouchable. Cold. Calculated. A man who ran his lands with terrifying efficiency and treated emotional entanglements like unnecessary risk. He rarely interacted with the servants directly. He had stewards for that. He had managers for that. His days were filled with ledgers, trade negotiations, and the endless political games that came with controlling one of the largest territories in the region. But something about Elira had caught his attention months ago, long before anyone else knew her secret. It happened during a routine inspection of the estate grounds. He had been walking through the gardens, discussing crop yields with his steward, when he passed the kitchen courtyard and saw her kneeling beside an injured stable boy who had fallen from a ladder. Every other servant had frozen, unsure what to do, terrified of interrupting the Duke's presence. But Elira hadn't hesitated. She had torn a strip from her own apron, pressed it against the boy's bleeding arm, and calmly instructed someone to fetch the physician, all without once looking up to check if anyone important was watching. Alaric had watched from a distance, saying nothing, but something about her instinctive courage stuck with him. In a household full of people terrified of making mistakes in front of him, she was the only one who acted like the injured boy mattered more than his own reputation. He didn't approach her. He didn't even ask her name that day. But he remembered. Over the following weeks, he found himself noticing her more than he intended to. The way she worked without complaint, even when other maids whispered about the unfairness of their duties. The way she treated the elderly cook with genuine respect instead of the performative politeness most servants reserved for people who couldn't help their careers. The way she never seemed to perform kindness for an audience, only offering it when she thought no one important was watching. He told himself it was simple curiosity. Nothing more. Then the rumors about her pregnancy reached him. He heard it the way he heard most household gossip, second-hand, through his steward, delivered with the kind of disapproving tone servants used when discussing scandal. The steward expected the Duke to order her immediate dismissal. That was the standard practice. That was what tradition demanded. Instead, Alaric asked a single question that caught the steward completely off guard. Is she being treated fairly? The steward hesitated. Treated fairly, my lord. By the other staff. Is she being treated fairly, or is she being punished for something that isn't anyone's business but her own? The steward, unsure how to answer a question he'd never expected the Duke to ask, admitted the truth. The other maids had turned cold. Some had grown outright cruel. Elira had been assigned the worst chores, the longest hours, the coldest corners of the estate to work in, all as unofficial punishment for a scandal that wasn't technically against any actual rule. Alaric said nothing more that day. But something inside him had shifted. He began watching her more closely after that, not out of suspicion, but out of something he couldn't quite name yet. He noticed the exhaustion in her eyes that she tried to hide. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly by the end of long shifts, though she never once asked for relief. He noticed the quiet dignity she carried even as whispers followed her through every hallway she walked. He also noticed something the other servants seemed to overlook entirely. She never complained. Not once. Not even when the cruelty aimed at her grew sharper. Not even when she was assigned physical labor no pregnant woman should have been doing. She simply endured it, silently, with the kind of quiet strength that made Alaric increasingly uncomfortable with his own inaction. For a man who prided himself on control and detachment, this was new territory. He told himself repeatedly that it wasn't his place to interfere in servant politics. He told himself that getting personally involved in her situation would only invite more gossip, more scrutiny, more risk to the careful reputation he had spent years building. But every time he told himself that, he found himself walking past the kitchens a little more often than necessary. The turning point came on a freezing autumn evening, 3 weeks before the incident that would change everything. Elira had been sent to fetch water from the well at the far edge of the estate, a task normally given to younger, unburdened maids, not a woman 7 months pregnant navigating uneven stone paths in the dark. But the head housekeeper had assigned it anyway, either out of genuine oversight or quiet cruelty disguised as routine duty. Halfway across the courtyard, exhausted and light-headed from a day of non-stop labor, Elira's foot caught on a loose stone. She fell hard. The water bucket clattered away into the darkness. Pain shot through her side as she hit the ground, and for a terrifying moment, she couldn't tell if the pain was from the fall or something far more dangerous happening inside her. She tried to call for help, but her voice came out weak, swallowed by the cold night air. By pure chance, Alaric was crossing the courtyard on his way back from a late meeting with his land stewards. He heard something, a faint sound barely louder than the wind, and something instinctive made him stop and listen instead of continuing on. He found her curled on the cold stone, clutching her stomach, tears streaking silently down her face, too proud even in that moment to sob loudly enough to draw attention. Every calculated, careful instinct he had built over years of emotional discipline disappeared in an instant. He didn't call for a servant. He didn't send for help first. He knelt down himself, right there in the dirt, in his fine coat, and gently lifted her into his arms without a moment's hesitation. "I'm fine," she whispered, humiliated, trying weakly to push him away. "Please, my lord, someone will see." "I don't care who sees," he said, his voice sharper than he intended, though not from anger. From something closer to fear. "Stop talking and hold on." He carried her himself all the way to the estate's private physician's quarters, ignoring the shocked stares of servants who happened to witness a duke personally carrying a pregnant maid through the main hallway like she weighed nothing at all. The physician confirmed that both Elira and the baby were, thankfully, unharmed, though badly shaken. Exhaustion and stress had likely caused the fall more than any external danger. But something had cracked open inside Alaric that night that could not be closed again. He sat outside her recovery room for hours, refusing to leave despite the disapproving whispers of the staff who couldn't understand why their notoriously detached duke was suddenly so invested in a servant's well-being. When Elira finally woke and found him still there, she was too exhausted to hide her confusion. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the cold authority everyone expected from him. "Because no one else was going to make sure you were okay," he said. "And I couldn't accept that." From that night forward, everything began to change. He ordered her chores reassigned to lighter duties, framing it publicly as standard policy for any pregnant staff member, though everyone quietly understood it was specifically for her. He ensured she had proper meals, proper rest, proper care from the estate physician. He never made a public announcement about his growing concern for her. He didn't need to. The staff noticed everything. And so did the other maids who had once mocked her. Their jealousy curdled quickly into something uglier. If the Duke was showing this much attention to a disgraced pregnant servant, they reasoned, there had to be something scandalous behind it. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. Some whispered that Elira had seduced him deliberately. Others claimed she had used dark magic to manipulate his affections. The cruelest among them suggested the baby wasn't a stranger's child at all, but the Duke's own, conceived through some secret affair he was now trying to cover up through elaborate kindness. None of it was true. But truth rarely slows down gossip once it starts running. Elira heard every whisper. She felt every judgmental glance. And despite Alaric's efforts to shield her, the cruelty didn't stop. If anything, his attention only made things worse, turning her from an overlooked scandal into the center of an entire household's obsession. She began to withdraw, terrified that her presence was creating chaos she never intended to cause. She started avoiding him in hallways, deflecting his questions about her well-being, insisting she was fine even when exhaustion and stress were clearly written across her face. Alaric noticed the shift immediately. He confronted her directly one evening in the quiet study where she had been sent to deliver documents. "You're avoiding me," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation laced with concern. "I'm not avoiding you," she lied. "I'm simply doing my job." Elira. It was the first time he had used her name instead of a title or formal address, and something about hearing it from him made her breath catch. You don't have to protect me from gossip. I can handle whispers. What I can't handle is watching you suffer in silence because you're afraid of making things worse for me." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "I never asked for any of this," she said, her voice breaking. "I never asked for your kindness. I never asked to be the reason people whisper every time you walk past." "I know," he said gently. "None of this is your fault. Not the whispers. Not the cruelty. None of it. Then why does it feel like I've ruined everything just by existing?" The question hung heavy in the air between them. Alaric crossed the room slowly, closing the distance she had spent weeks trying to maintain. "You haven't ruined anything," he said quietly. "If anything, you've reminded me what actual courage looks like. Everyone in this household is terrified of me. Terrified of disappointing me, terrified of losing their positions, terrified of saying the wrong thing in front of me. You're the only person who has never once treated me like something to fear." "That's not true," she whispered. "I'm terrified of you too." "No," he said softly. "You're terrified of what people will think if they see you trust me. That's different." She had no response to that, because he was right, and they both knew it. From that moment forward, something unspoken shifted between them. He began finding small reasons to check on her throughout the day. She began finding herself looking forward to those brief moments more than she wanted to admit. Neither of them said anything about it directly. Neither of them needed to. But the household did. The rumors intensified. The head housekeeper, feeling her authority threatened by the Duke's obvious favoritism, began pushing back harder, assigning Elira tasks that violated the very restrictions Alaric had put in place, testing how far she could go before someone stopped her. It was during one of these deliberately cruel assignments, forcing Elira to carry heavy linens up 3 flights of stairs alone, that everything finally came to a head. Elira collapsed halfway up the staircase, overwhelmed by exhaustion, stress, and the physical strain her body simply couldn't handle anymore. Servants rushed to her aid, panic spreading through the hallway as word reached Alaric almost instantly. He arrived within minutes, and what he saw ignited something in him that the entire household would remember for years afterward. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice, calm and controlled, carried more authority in that moment than any shout ever could. "Who assigned this task?" Silence answered him first, then, hesitantly, the truth. The head housekeeper stepped forward, chin raised, prepared to defend her decision as standard household discipline. "She is a servant like any other," the housekeeper said stiffly. "She should be held to the same standards." "She is 7 months pregnant," Alaric said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she has been deliberately targeted by staff who believe cruelty is an acceptable substitute for discipline. My lord, surely you understand the position this puts the household in. People are already talking about your interest in her. If you continue defending her so publicly, let them talk." His voice cut through the hallway like a blade. "I am done pretending indifference to protect a reputation that was never worth more than a person's safety." He turned to Elira, who was still trying to steady herself against the wall, humiliation and exhaustion warring across her face. And that was the moment. The moment everything the household had whispered about for weeks was about to become undeniable truth. Alaric knelt in front of her, right there in the hallway, in front of every servant who had ever mocked her, every maid who had ever whispered cruel names behind her back, every steward who had ever questioned his judgment. "I should have done this weeks ago," he said quietly, loud enough only for her to hear. "I was too afraid of what people would say. I'm done being afraid." Then he stood, faced the entire gathered household, and said the words that would echo through the estate for years to come. "She will be mine." The hallway fell into stunned silence. "I am not asking for permission," he continued, his voice steady and unshakable. "I am not asking for approval. I am telling you what will happen. Elira will no longer be treated as a servant in this household. She will be treated with the respect and care she has always deserved, and anyone who continues to disrespect her will answer directly to me." Someone gasped. Someone else dropped a tray, the metallic clatter echoing off stone walls that had never witnessed anything like this before. Elira stood frozen, overwhelmed, certain she had misheard him entirely. "My lord," she whispered, "you don't have to do this. You don't owe me anything." "I'm not doing this because I owe you something," he interrupted gently. I'm doing this because for the first time in my life, someone showed me kindness without expecting anything in return, and I refuse to let fear of gossip stop me from returning it." The head housekeeper, pale and speechless, opened her mouth as if to protest, then thought better of it entirely. Word of what happened in that hallway spread through the estate within hours, then through the surrounding villages within days, then eventually through the entire region within weeks. The story shifted with every retelling, exaggerated and embellished the way stories always are, but the core of it remained unchanged. The most powerful, most emotionally guarded men in the territory had publicly chosen a pregnant, disgraced servant girl over every noblewoman who had ever pursued him. Some called it scandal. Others called it madness. But slowly, as more details emerged, as people learned about the fire that took her family, the men who abandoned her, the cruelty she endured in silence, the narrative began shifting from scandal to something entirely different. Admiration. Because underneath all the gossip was a simple truth nobody could deny. Elira had never once used her circumstances to manipulate anyone. She had never sought pity, never sought special treatment, never used her pregnancy as an excuse to escape her responsibilities. She had simply survived, quietly and with more dignity than most people could manage in far easier circumstances. And Alaric, for all his cold reputation, had proven that beneath the calculated exterior was a man capable of recognizing genuine goodness when he saw it, even when society told him he shouldn't. In the weeks that followed, the estate transformed. The cruelty that had once defined Elira's daily existence evaporated almost entirely, partly out of genuine shifting attitudes, partly out of simple fear of the Duke's wrath. The head housekeeper was quietly reassigned to a different property, her authority stripped without public humiliation, a mercy Alaric extended despite everything. Elira, still adjusting to a life she never could have imagined, found herself overwhelmed by the sudden shift from scorn to respect. She struggled with it at first, uncomfortable with servants who now bowed slightly when she passed, uncertain how to navigate a world that had so recently despised her. Alaric noticed her discomfort and addressed it directly, as he always did. "You don't have to change who you are," he told her one evening as they sat together in the private garden that had quickly become her favorite refuge. "I didn't choose you because I wanted someone different. I chose you because of exactly who you already are." "Everyone expects me to become someone else now," she admitted. "Someone polished. Someone who belongs in rooms like this." "You already belong," he said simply. "You belonged before any of this happened. Everyone else just needed time to see it." As her pregnancy progressed, Alaric remained constant in ways she never expected from a man raised to value control above all else. He attended every physician's appointment despite his overwhelming responsibilities. He personally oversaw preparations for the child's arrival, insisting on details most nobles would have delegated entirely to staff. He learned, slowly and sometimes clumsily, how to express the emotions he had spent his entire adult life suppressing. 2 months later, on a stormy evening that mirrored the chaos of the night they first truly connected, Elira gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Alaric was in the room the entire time, refusing every suggestion that he wait outside as tradition demanded. When the baby's cries finally filled the room, something inside him broke open completely, years of carefully constructed emotional walls collapsing in an instant. He held the child as though she were the most fragile, most important thing he had ever touched. "She's not mine by blood," he said quietly to Elira, exhaustion and wonder mixing in his voice. "But she's mine in every way that matters." Elira, too overwhelmed to speak, simply reached for his hand. The household that had once mocked her relentlessly now celebrated the child's arrival with genuine warmth, a transformation that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. In the following months, whispers about scandal faded entirely, replaced by something far more powerful. Stories about the Duke who chose love over reputation, who prioritized genuine character over social expectation, who proved that true strength wasn't measured by emotional detachment, but by the courage to care deeply despite every risk involved. Elira never fully forgot the cruelty she endured, the nights she cried alone, the humiliation she carried silently for months. But she also never let that pain define her future. She used it instead as a foundation for something rare, a genuine partnership built not on convenience or arrangement, but on mutual respect earned through struggle. Alaric, once known throughout the region as cold and unreachable, became known instead for something far more memorable. Not power. Not wealth. Not the untouchable reputation he had spent years building. He became known as the man who saw worth where everyone else saw scandal, who chose compassion when convenience would have been easier, who proved that the loudest, most powerful thing a person can do is simply choose kindness, even when the entire world is watching and waiting for you to choose otherwise. Years later, people in that region still tell the story differently depending on who's speaking. Some remember it as scandal. Some remember it as fairy tale. But everyone who witnessed that hallway moment, everyone who saw a duke kneel in front of a pregnant servant girl and refused to care what anyone thought, remembers the same undeniable truth. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are exactly the ones worth choosing. And sometimes the strongest, most powerful people are the ones brave enough to admit that. If this story moved you even a little, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and stick around because the next video might just hit even harder.